Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Narratives of Grace podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Kaleb Barrett. In this episode of the Pastor's Corner, Pastor Dennis and I discuss what is communion, why is it important, why do we celebrate it, and what is it going to look like in this time of COVID. While we haven't been able to celebrate it as a church family, we want to make sure that we're prepared to be able to take it this Sunday, but do so safely to make sure that everyone stays healthy and well and doesn't have to worry about illness while they are partaking in this sacrament of the church. Let's take a listen. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Pastor's Corner. Today, Pastor Dennis and I will be talking about communion.
Yes. We're talking about, and different, obviously we're Baptist, and so a lot of folks, when you hear communion, you think, oh, is that a Catholic thing? No. So a lot of places you'll hear it called the Lord's Supper, but Lord's Supper, communion, they essentially the same thing. A lot of times the method may be a little bit different, but in both, you're consuming the elements. And now, what are those elements? That's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so anyone that's been at a church during a communion or Lord's Supper time, it's usually not an entire service, but time within the service, you'll see some type of bread and some type of fruit of the vine being passed, and that what those different things are usually does depend on the church and on formality of the church and just what they want to do with that. But a lot of times it's crackers of some sort and grape juice.
Yeah, crackers, wafers. Sometimes it's an actual loaf of bread,
which is my favorite.
Yeah, and so there's different ways to do it, and ultimately, the exact type of bread is not. It's not the most important aspect of communion, although there are different forms or different types of bread or different types of wafers or crackers that are a little bit more symbolic. There's a type of wafer or type of cracker that you can actually see where it has been baked. You can see there's the brown. Kind of the golden brown on there, and so as there's little bumps and things on there, so as the bread was sitting on whatever surface it was being cooked on, that the points of contact were not burnt, but they were cooked a little bit more, and it actually has a striping effect. And a lot of places, though, a lot of churches will use that type of bread because it reminds us of Isaiah 53, and by his stripes we have been healed. And so the bread that represents his body is striped just as his body was striped and beaten for us.
Yeah, and there's a lot of thought that typically will go into different aspects of the Lord's Supper time, and I think it's important that we give it thought. I think too many churches, especially in Baptist circles, kind of just blow through it to make sure that it gets done. And in the same way, in other denominations that give it more effort or whatnot, the spirit's not there. So I'd much rather have it be a side thought, but the spirit there. But I think it's something that we can definitely give that time and attention to while making sure that it is for the sake of remembering and honoring what Christ told us to do, and not because this is a ritual that we have to perform.
Yeah, I've been at churches where you can clearly tell that, whether visiting or just in attendance, visiting churches where you can clearly tell this is just tacked on, and it's that time of the quarter or it's that time of the month that we've got to do this, and it seems as though it's almost like a, I don't want to say sideshow, but it's almost like this. We got to do this, but listen, let's just get through it together, and then we'll get back to our normal, regularly scheduled broadcasting or whatever, and This is such an important moment. Every time we partake of the Lord's Supper, it is an important moment for us as a body of believers. And different churches do it differently. There's closed communion, there's open communion. We'll talk about those in just a minute. But there's different methods. There's different ways that they pass out the elements. Do you pass them out one at a time? Do you pass them both out at the same time? And there should be a reason behind every part of that. And when you go to a place where you can tell it's just rushed through, there's not a lot of thought put into it, it's disappointing.
Yeah.
For me, it's almost like, why are we doing this? Like, if this doesn't matter, then this is an awfully strange demonstration if it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. No, it's true. And for anyone that knows me, knows that my area is worship, and this is an important part of worship. So much so that this is one of the core parts of why the Reformation happened. Back then and still now, the Catholic Church had 7 sacraments, I believe. But most of those aren't scriptural. When you look at scriptural doctrine, we don't see 7 different sacraments. We don't see a sacrament of last rites, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be praying for somebody as they near the end of their life, but it's not a sacrament. It's not something that you need towards salvation. But when we look at scripture, we really only see 2 sacraments. We see baptism and communion. And I think too often still today we gloss over it and we forget that they were so important that these men and women risked their lives to leave the church and say, nope, that's not how it's supposed to be. Communion is not this weird philosophy of transformation, certain parts of the bread into the body, but not other parts. And this is no, that's not what's happening. But this is actually what's happening. We need to remember that. And there are several views of it, and the fancy word for the one that the Catholic Church held to and still holds to is transubstantiation. But that in and of itself is a conversation for another time. But most Baptist churches and most evangelical conservative churches hold to the memorial view of communion.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a few really good points that there's a reason why Protestants broke away from the church. Communion and the methodology behind it was part of that, recognizing that the bread was not the actual body of Jesus, but it represents the body that was broken for us. The wine or the grape juice, depending on which denomination you're in, the wine or the grape juice, it does not become his blood as you drink it. It helps you to remember the blood that was spilled to save you from your sins. And so when you talk about communion being an aspect of worship, there are 2 ordinances within the church, and baptism is commanded. We are to go down into the water and be baptized. We are commanded to, as often as we eat of this bread and drink of this cup, we are to do so in remembrance of him. And so when you said this is a memorial, that is what it is. It is a memorial. It reminds us of what's happening, but it's not only a memorial.
Mm-hmm.
We don't only do it to remember. It's also a very spiritual thing because it is a time for us to reflect. It's a time for us to remember. But it's also a time for us to rededicate and to look at our lives, examine our hearts. Jeremiah tells us that our hearts are deceitfully wicked. Who can know it? Well, we have a pretty good idea of some of the wicked things that we store up in our hearts. And whether we're willing to admit it to others or not, that's another story. But part of what happens in communion or in the Lord's Supper is we let go of those things and we say, God, I need you to come in and clean my heart and remove these things from me. Your body was broken, your blood was spilled, not so that I can continue to live my life as I see fit, but so that I would be free to live my life as you see fit. And it's because of that this becomes a very spiritual, worshipful practice, in that we are examining our hearts, we're examining our walk, we're examining our desires, our motivations, and we're remembering that we are only able to gather together as believers. We're only able to draw breath because of a measure of His grace.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment when we're holding that bread and we're listening to whoever's officiating, we're listening to them as they read those words from Christ. It says, "This is my body. Do this in remembrance of me. This is my body that was broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And that's when you consume of the bread. And for me, having that moment of just thinking back to the disciples on that night, in the first installment of the Lord's Supper, when He first did that, I tried to imagine myself sitting in that room and thinking, I know my perspective now is I'm on the other side of that. So I know what He was talking about, because we know the rest of the story. You know,
Mm-hmm.
this is pre-crucifixion. And so I can only imagine that they were sitting in that room and thinking to themselves, what in the world is going on here?
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
and because Scripture tells us they didn't understand until later. Later, they understood all the things that He had told them. You know, on the road to Emmaus, it wasn't until He broke the bread that the disciples on the road to Emmaus were like, "Oh, that's what He was talking about." And then what happened? They ran back to Jerusalem to share with the other disciples that they had seen Jesus. And so there's this moment where you consume of that bread, and your mind should go back to, what did Christ go through for us?
Mm-hmm.
And it should cause us to want to live for Him. I think I said that on Sunday, that Jesus died for us. The least we could do is live for Him. When we remember what He went through to save us from our sins, we should feel more empowered to live obedient lives.
No, yeah, and there's a lot in that we need to remember. One of which, like you said, the disciples had no idea what was going on, and part of that is because they were having their Passover meal, and we talked about this a lot during Holy Week this year. So if you want to look back at some of those videos on our YouTube page, and I think most of the sermons are on the podcast, but one of the things to know is when Christ did this, when Christ initiated the first Lord's Supper, which we still hold to now 2,000 some years later, it was a time during the Passover of remembering and commemorating the old covenant. So He was basically saying, okay, that was right. That was then. Now here's the new covenant in my blood versus the blood of the lamb, blood of the perfect lamb. And so everybody there is like, wait, what's going on? Because most of them, while they may have said that He was the Son of God, while they said He was the Messiah, while they said all of these things, like you said, they didn't really realize it until they saw Him 3 days after the crucifixion. But that's such a significant thing. And I think when we're like, oh yeah, that would have been cool to be there, or things like that, it would be like, it would have been crazy to be there as one of them in that culture, understanding what it is. But it is important to remember, when we talk about the memorial view, that doesn't mean that it's just redoing. It's not just doing to remember, that there is that spiritual aspect of it. And part of it is when people point, well, it says, do this in remembrance of me, is in Old Testament worship, when they did those things, they were spiritually enacting it with the person that did it originally, with the Passover. They were doing it with those that were present leaving Egypt. So doing it in remembrance of Him, we're still enacting it spiritually with the disciples. And when we say that doesn't make sense, it's like, right.
Yeah. Well, and I think you also touched on something that I think is important for us to remember. One, it's remembering what happened, but it's also an aspect of community and being present, I think is the word you used. Just, remembering everything that's happened up to this point. They were going through Passover. This was a moment for them that they're thinking, how does this correlate? We know what Passover is. We think we understand what he's talking about, but then he says, I'm not going to drink of this. And he hands the cup over. And, I just, in my mind, I think, man, if I was there, I'd be like, okay, Jesus, we got it. But then in reality, I think, no, I'd have been right there with them. We're like, what is he talking about? And thinking we understand. And then 3 days later being like, oh, okay. It all makes sense now. Why? Because the very next day he died and your whole world comes crashing down. You're trying to figure out. I just spent 3 years walking through, this place with him and watching him do these incredible miracles and hearing him say these incredible things. And now he's gone. I thought he was going to establish something. And then he comes back, and it's in that moment that it's all of it now clicks and all of it begins to make sense. And now that final supper has a very specific meaning. And it's not just to be present in that room, but there's a reason why a lot of churches would not do communion during the COVID closures and everything. And why do you think that is, that churches held off on partaking of communion?
I think a lot of churches held off in part because communion is supposed to be a communal thing. It's supposed to be something that we do as a church family. And that's part of what it is communing. We commune with God, but it's within the body of the church. And you can do it at home with your family. And I think you should do it at home with your family. And we made a video on how to do that with Naomi and I taking communion together at home around Easter. But it's not really something that you can do online. It's not something as much that you can do streamed. Now, that's not to say that as we do the service streamed, we're going to turn it off for that part. But when it's only streamed, you lose a lot of it.
Yeah, I think there's an aspect of it that can still be done, but you lose the second aspect. And so the first one is the memorial, and obviously memorializing his death and what he went through on our behalf. That part you can still have with some sort of virtual rendering of the ceremony. However, as what you're saying, the community aspect, the communal aspect of the body coming together. And, it's hard because, for instance, this Sunday, you'll be preaching the sermon, but I'll be leading the communion part of the service. And it's hard when you're officiating a ceremony knowing that there are people who are going to be partaking of the elements who aren't in the same room as us. And that makes it a little bit difficult because we don't know anything about the people that aren't in the room. Right. We don't know where they are. We don't know what they're doing. There is an aspect of sitting in a room together with people, looking at them, taking communion together, and knowing there's an aspect of accountability that comes along with this, because we were specifically told and we're told in Scripture, anyone who eats or drinks unworthily, what do? They eat or drink to their own condemnation. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
Well, and that's an important thing, because part of that is unworthily in terms of you're not right with God in some way. Not that there's the aspect of confession like in the Catholic Church where you need to confess to a priest, but it's also you're just kind of doing it flippantly. We do see that they were just doing it as if it was a normal meal. And I think you can do it in terms of having a meal and that being recognizing communion within that. But when you do it as just we're having communion because we're eating dinner. No, when you do that, or you do it with when you're having issues with somebody, that's an unright heart. And really you're doing it in a way that you're not recognizing who God is. And if I remember correctly, there were people in the Corinthian church getting sick, and that was what Paul attributed it to. That's just that. It's that punishment of sorts. Now, we don't really see that today with people getting sick over, at least not that we recognize. But it's something that we need to take that time. We need to have a time of personal reflection and confession. We need to recognize what this is. And if you are having an issue with somebody, maybe you shouldn't take communion. If you're actively in a fight with somebody, maybe you shouldn't take it. And at one of my previous churches, that was a normal thing where somebody just, I'm not in the right place to take it today. I'm in a bad state of mind. I'm angry this morning for a fight that I had with a coworker on Friday. And if I take it, I'm not going to be I'm going to be doing it because this is what's happening right now, not because I'm recognizing what it is.
Right. Excuse me. And I know other people that for periods of time would choose not to take communion. And there's also historical examples. I think it was, and I know it's more than just him, but I think it was Spurgeon that openly would not commune slaveholders, slave runners, slave owners. He would not allow them to take communion. And I think we see some of that a little bit in today's world. Excuse me again. I think we see some of that in today's world with, if there's somebody who's blatant about their sin, if there's somebody who is just braggadocious over their sin and they have no issues, bragging or talking about their sin, and they seem to have no desire to rectify the sin issue that they're working with, and the church should not offer them communion. Now that gets awkward in today's world. I know you were talking about in the Corinthian church, there were people that were getting sick. Well, today, if there was a whole section of the church that took communion and got sick, in today's world, the first thought is not, what did those people do? The first thought is, how did you mess up juice? How did you get everyone sick with the juice? It's not, I think we're not as spiritually minded as the early church was in recognizing the correlation. And now I know things are a little bit different, but in today's world, there is an aspect of getting together, and there's an aspect of community and holding each other accountable and helping each other to have victory over their sin and to live lives where we don't want to just be moralists. We don't want to just be a good person and you can have communion, which ultimately that's really the way a lot of people have looked at communion for a long time, is as long as you're not doing anything blatant, you can have communion. Well, what about your heart?
Yeah.
What's the state of your heart? Jesus went beyond the law by saying, well, you've heard it said that if you murder, that's wrong. Well, I tell you, if you hate someone, you've already committed murder in your heart. And so he went beyond that. And why? Because the heart matters. The inclinations, the tendencies, the prejudices, the things that are going on inside of our heart, they matter. They matter to Jesus. They should matter to us. And as leaders in the church, that's why we put such a high value on communion. We don't just tack it on at the end of a service, or at least we shouldn't just tack it on at the end of the service and, well, let's just eat this bread, drink this cup, pray this prayer, and go home. No, that's not what communion is.
Yeah.
And so this Sunday, this is playing. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. The famous thing. But July 5th, Sunday, we will have communion, and it will look different. Now, why is it going to look different? Is it a spiritual reason it looks different? No. It's a practical reason. And so we are somewhat pragmatic in the way that we're doing communion this time. Hopefully, maybe by next time, some of the restrictions are removed. But under COVID, the way that we distribute the elements, the way we consume the elements is probably going to be slightly different. And now that might sound weird. The way we consume is going to be slightly different. I mean, you're still eating and drinking, but how?
Yeah, so that was a big discussion that we had as we were looking to have communion back in person again, is how are we going to do it to protect And I think it's when we were talking to the Phil-Am Church that they gave us the idea of using, and this is going to sound weird, prepackaged elements. Now, I've been at a service at a mega church that used these, and it was purely for sake of time, and I think that's problematic, but that's a whole nother discussion. But the idea is that these were put together in a facility that they're meeting all the health standards, but everything is already sealed. So that way somebody Sunday morning isn't pouring the juice that might be potentially sick and coughing in the juice. They may not be breaking apart the crackers or wafers or whatever, and they maybe have germs on their hands, which now I say that I will reemphasize here. Shireen, who does most of the elements preparation, she makes sure that she's hands washed, wears gloves, and all these things. So
she's a pro.
Yeah, she is. But it reduces the risk of anything else, but it also reduces the risk of nobody else is touching all of the open cups beforehand. Nobody is touching the pile of crackers beforehand. It is all in one little contained cup.
Yeah. And I understand what you're saying, that, the churches that used to use these for the sake of time, I can see both sides of that argument. Kind of like outsourcing, and, hey, let's get this stuff in here. I can see that because we don't have the same view of the cup or the bread that, let's say, the Catholics have. It's not as if these are made in a factory and a priest comes in and blesses everything and now we're good to use it. It's not that way. So I guess I could see both sides. I would prefer not to use these.
Yeah.
But I would also prefer to not be under COVID. I would prefer for this global pandemic to just go away and let us get back to normal. I'd prefer a lot of things lately, but our preferences don't always matter. And so when it comes to the safety and the health of everyone that's involved, this is the best way that we're going to be able to do it. And so similar to how the offering time is done, where the deacons come by or the ushers come by, and they don't pass the plate, they just walk by and people are able to drop things in the plate. This is actually really kind of almost going to be a reverse of that. The deacons are going to walk by and they will have the plate with the prepackaged elements in there and wearing gloves, and they will actually one by one hand out the elements. Now, the next question is, these are prepackaged, which means they come in a sealed container. It's a very small container. It's a thimble-sized container. It has 2 layers. You open the first layer, you get the bread. You open the second layer, you get the juice. What does somebody do, Pastor Kaleb, if they have trouble opening the container?
So we'll have a couple people with gloves. The deacons will help as they're able to, but we'll have a couple other people as well. That if you're not able to, if you have arthritis and you can't quite pinch enough to get it, or if you're having trouble just with whatever else that they have practiced, they'll have tried it beforehand. Actually, I'll be down and I'll be able to help as well, because I have used these a couple times. I've used them once recently with the gathering this past Sunday to just help with that. But again, we'll have gloves on to make sure that there isn't that. But so we're making sure that if you do have trouble with that for whatever reason, that you're still able to get into your packaged elements.
Right. So no matter how you slice it, that's a bad pun, no pun intended there, but no matter how you slice it, the bread and the cup are going to be available. So if you are here, we've been talking about doing different things, like potentially setting up stations in different areas. I think that for this week, the best practice would be to keep it as close to the way we have been doing it as possible. Would probably be key. We don't want to change too many things too quickly, but I think eventually we can look at maybe adopting a different method. I like the idea. I was at a church in Georgia, and what I say, I was at a church. It was the last church we were at, and they did it differently at different times. But one time in particular, the pastor there, his name's Danny McGill. At the time, he set it up so that deacons served their families at the various stations. And so the families got up, they went to the station, and then their deacon was who they went to. And then if you didn't have a deacon, or if you didn't know who your deacon was, which is problematic, but if you didn't, you could just go to any station. And so the idea there was to make it work and go up to the different stations. I like that idea. I like the idea of fathers serving their wife and their kids.
Yeah.
I like the idea of making it more of a family thing, and the way that the gathering did it on Saturday was, I think, really cool. The way they played the music, and then as people felt led, they were able to walk up to the front, take up their cup, and then go back to their seats and consume as a family. And I think there are many different methods, and it's not that one is necessarily better than the others. There are some that are definitely better than others, but I think as long as the memorial aspect and the spiritual sign are both there, as long as the community aspect is still there, I think that you're on the right track. With how you choose to consume. Like I said, there's different methods. I've been at a church where there's one very large loaf of bread, and everybody comes up and pulls off a piece, and there are some people who think, this is the best way to do it, and there's other people that it gives them a complex because everyone is touching that same loaf of bread.
Yeah, and I understand that, and that's the way my last church in Texas did it, and that is my preferred way because there's more symbolism to it. With we're all from the same body, we're all from the same piece of bread.
Having the bread literally broken in front of you is a great reminder. Not really practical under COVID.
No, especially not under COVID. And we were actually I was talking to somebody before COVID hit about a way to potentially do it that was more sanitary, at least in appearance. But then COVID hit and it's not practical at all anymore.
I think the only way that would work now, and this is the part of the podcast where we just think out loud. No, but seriously, I think the way that could work now would be whoever's officiating, that's the person breaking the bread, and they wear gloves, and as people come up, they break the bread off and hand it out, and I feel like that's doable.
I think you'd need two. I think it would need to be, so the way that church did it in Texas is they broke it and two elders took it and brought it around to everyone else. I feel like for that to work, like you're saying, if you were to break it and you and I were to each take it and hand it out individually, that could work. But there's still other concerns to it.
Right. Yeah, and so, as you're listening, you may have been at a church where they did it completely differently, and I think it would be cool. This is going to be posted on Facebook. It's going to be posted in really all of the major podcast platforms, Anchor, Spotify, Apple. I think it's even probably in the Google Play Store as part of the podcasts there, But my point in saying all that is this video is going to be posted to our Facebook page, and it would be cool if you commented some of the different methods that you've seen, and just share your thoughts and the way that you've seen it done, and then talk about, if you want, comment and tell us why communion is important to you. Mm-hmm. Why does it matter to you? But we're gonna start this Sunday, July 5th, and there's one more change that we were gonna talk about.
Yeah. So for anyone that's been a member of our church for a while, hopefully that we've been doing communion every 6 weeks, and then it goes back and forth between the morning services and the evening services. And that functionally means that you're doing it, if you only come to morning or evening, you're doing it once a quarter, which is not untypical in a Baptist church. But I think, especially coming out of communion, and I've talked about it with Pastor John and Pastor Dennis, and we kind of came to the same conclusion that we need to step up the frequency just a little bit. So starting this Sunday, we're going to start doing communion monthly on the first Sunday of each month, but it'll still go back and forth between morning and evening. One that is to do it a little bit more frequently, but then also it's a little bit easier for the church body to keep track of when it's coming. It's not a surprise that it's this Sunday, but last time it was the second Sunday, and now it's the fifth Sunday, but it's just because of the way the things landed. But I'm hoping, and we're hoping, that doing it with this increased frequency, we understand it, the importance of it a little bit, and that we can focus on that spiritual nature of communion.
Yeah, and I think doing it the first Sunday, I would say the first service, whether it's morning or evening of the month, because there will be some months that we don't have an evening service that first week. Like for instance, if it just so happens that the first Sunday falls on New Year's Day or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, there may be some times that we hold off on that, but for the most part, it's always going to be either morning or evening, first Sunday morning or evening service of the month. And there may be times in the future that we do a special communion ceremony or a special service where communion is an aspect of that special service. I think our plan this year for Maundy Thursday was to do communion together. Yeah. And of course, that was right after COVID and the closures began. And so we weren't able. So I think next year we'll see that as an aspect of Holy Week. I think that at some point during Advent would be an important time for us to take an extra time of remembrance. So there are different things that you'll see moving forward, but again, you know, we do this because we place a very high value on the worship side of communion. This is not just something that we do because we're Christians and we got to do it. You know, There's two ordinances, you got to get them both in. No, we don't do it just because we have to. We do it because it means something, and it means something to us. And ultimately, and I think we can close on this, and you can add more if you want, but for me, this is the culmination of what Jesus' earthly ministry was. The death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus was the culmination of his work. And he, on the cross, said, "It is finished." This meal, very small meal, but this meal, the bread and the cup, they are a reminder of his finished work for us. The reminder of his finished work should never for us be flippant. It should never be something that we just do just because. Yeah. If this didn't happen, what we are remembering every time we take of that bread and take of that cup, every time we remember this, if what we're remembering didn't happen, everything else, Paul says, is pointless. It's all for nothing. But it did happen. He did die. His body was broken. His blood was spilled. And he did that for us. And then 3 days later, he rose from the grave. So we're remembering his death and we're celebrating his resurrection. And this matters to us.
Yeah. And I agree. And to that, my belief in worship, and this is something that maybe can be its own pastor's corner, but that communion is the climax of worship. It is the point of worship. Worship is drawing near to God through communion. That is the core of what worship is. And so when we partake of communion, the Lord's Supper, we need to realize that that is the point of worship.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to put this podcast together. I think this is an important and a needed topic for us to consider, for us to go through as we prepare for July 5th. We hope everyone has a safe and happy July 4th holiday. And it's interesting that we're able to remember the Lord's death as we're celebrating our freedom as Americans, and remembering his death gave us a greater freedom. Mm-hmm. And I hope that we can remember that as we move through this upcoming weekend, and just recognize just how good God truly is.
Amen. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Narratives of Grace podcast. I hope that this was informative and a little bit deeper of a look at what communion is than what we sometimes get during communion services. For anyone that's listening before this Sunday, July 5th, we want to let you know that we will be partaking in the Lord's Supper this Sunday, and this will be the first time back in person taking it. And we hope that you've been able to do it as a family between the last time we took it before the lockdowns to now. But for anyone that hasn't, we invite you to join us this Sunday at Mililani Baptist Church. For any questions or comments about this topic or anything you'd like us to discuss in the future, please email us at pastor@mbaptist.org. And for any prayer requests, please email us at prayer@mbaptist.org. For more information on Mililani Baptist Church, please head over to our website at mbaptist.org or follow us on social media or YouTube. Thank you for joining us today. I pray that you have a blessed week.